Hello, my name is Bijan Elahi. I'll be presenting a webinar today on the subject of safety risk management for medical devices. After the presentation, there will be a Q&A session where I'll answer your questions. Before I start, I will briefly introduce myself. I'm a systems engineer, a medical device product developer, and a university educator. My mission is to make the world a better place by creating safer medical devices more efficiently and more quickly. I started my career in aerospace working at NASA on the Space Shuttle before transitioning to the medical device industry. In the early 1990s, the medical device industry was getting more serious about safety risk management, but they didn't have much experience with it. They reached out to aerospace, who had about 50 years of experience on this topic, and asked for help. And that's how I ended up in the medtech industry. I have worked at a number of companies from small startups to the largest medtech companies in the world. Most of the products that I have developed have been Class 3 implantable devices such as pacemakers and deep brain stimulators. What I teach is based on up-to-date practical experience in product development and successful submissions for regulatory approval. I am based in Florida, USA, and serve the whole world, from the Far East to the Far West and everything in between. Before COVID-19, I used to travel a lot and teach and consult on-site in many countries, but now most of my teaching is done online due to COVID-19. Risk management is my passion, and I have trained over 4,500 people so far. I teach a graduate course in safety risk management at Eindhoven University of Technology to doctoral students in engineering, and I speak at many conferences around the world to spread the knowledge of safety risk management. I'm a contributor to the standard ISO 14971, and lastly, I am the author of this best-selling book on safety risk management for medical devices, published by Elsevier Publishing of London, UK, as part of their portfolio of medical books under the label of Academic Press. It is available at all major booksellers. Risk management takes time and energy and costs money. Most of you are product developers interested in spending your time in making the devices work. So why spend the energy to do risk management? If you want to commercialize a medical product, you must manage its safety risks and persuade the regulatory agencies that your product is safe and effective. When you do and provide evidence, then the gates open and you can get through. On this slide, I've marked the walls with the letters FDA for the US, but you could substitute any regulatory entity in any country. Another reason we do risk management is for resource optimization. We don't have an infinite amount of time, money, people, materials, etc. To get the most value from our resources, we want to apply the right amount of resources to the problem, not too much and not too little. This goes beyond medical devices. In many business endeavors, knowing the critical aspects of the system and the magnitude of the risks associated with those areas helps you spend the right amount of resources and not too much. Let's say you are a system safety engineer and you're given this system. It's a playhouse where children play. Your job is to make this system safe. Unbeknownst to you, there is a hazard in this system and it is hiding somewhere in the system. Without knowing what this hazard is, where it is, and how big it is, what would you do? You would use the most powerful tool that you have available. While if you knew the extent of the threat, it would take much less resources to solve the problem. When people operate out of fear instead of knowledge, they tend to over-engineer things. You may think that as an educator of risk management, I spend most of my time teaching people to do more for safety, but it's actually the opposite. I find that most engineers and companies want to do the right thing and make safer products, but since they operate out of fear, they tend to over-engineer things. Another reason for doing risk management is cost control. We must fix safety risks. The later a problem is fixed, the more expensive it is. Pre-market risk management helps prevent safety risks early. Our patients trust their lives to us. We have a moral obligation to our patients to produce the safest possible products for them. And we have a legal obligation too. Releasing unsafe products can have serious legal consequences. I don't know how many of you have heard of the PIP breast implants. To increase profits, the French manufacturer PIP deliberately substituted industrial-grade silicone for medical-grade silicone, which led to the injury and deaths of many women. Jean-Claude Moss, founder of the company, went to prison for 4 years for this crime. Another benefit from risk management is better communication among the teams. People tend to spend most of their time with their own functional teams and not talk much to the people in other teams. For example, people in the R&D may not talk much with the clinical people. This is called siloing. It's not because these people don't like each other. It's just that there is only so much time available and they prefer to spend that time to work with people within their own teams. Risk management, because of its multidisciplinary nature, requires people of various teams to talk to each other. This brings real value to the company by discovering mistakes early and fixing them. Even though risk management produces a risk management report, which is mandatory to get regulatory approval, the purpose of risk management process should not be to produce a report, but to influence the design of the system to ensure that it is inherently more safe when it enters the market. So we talked about why we should do risk management. The next question is, so what is risk? ISO 14971 defines risk as a combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. This definition is somewhat unclear because how do you know how to combine two very dissimilar things? One is the probability of occurrence and the other one is the severity. Alan Willett wrote an article, a journal article in 1901 in which has this sentence: risk is the objectified uncertainty regarding the occurrence of an undesirable event. An objectified uncertainty regarding the occurrence of an undesirable event. What's interesting about this sentence are two things. One of them is that it talks about an undesirable event. Risk is never about good things. We always worry about things that we don't want to happen. For example, do you worry about the risk of having a healthy child? Or do you worry about the risk of getting a very good job? No. You worry about things that you don't want to happen. The other aspect of this sentence is that it talks about an objectified uncertainty. Really, he's talking about a probability. If you think about how you speak about risk, you use the terms that relate to probability. For example, you would say, what's the chance of getting into a car accident? What's the probability of catching COVID-19? What are the odds of being in an airplane crash? The language of Alan Willett's definition is antiquated. This is a more modern restatement of the same thing. The risk is the probability of occurrence of something undesirable. For the medical device industry, this is a better definition. Risk is the probability of sustaining harm in a hazardous situation. Because it uses two key terms from ISO 14971, harm and hazardous situation. Risk is an emergent system property. So what does that mean? It means that the question of risk can only be answered in the context of a system. I'll speak more on this in the next slides. You hear the word risk a lot, but have you noticed that risk means different things depending on who's speaking? Here I will show you 8 kinds of risk. And this is not all. When your project manager is talking about risk, he or she is talking about the risk to the project. What are the chances of being late or over budget on this project? When a technical engineer talks about risk, he or she is talking about technical risk. What are the chances of my design not meeting the requirements? Or what are the chances that I may infringe on somebody else's IP, intellectual property? When a CEO is talking about risk, he or she is talking about business risk. What's the probability of losing money on this project? Here I'm talking only about one type of risk, and that is safety risk. And even that comes in 2 flavors. Risk to the health of the patient or the user from the use of a medical device, and EHS risk, or environmental health and safety risk. This is a risk to your health and safety, but it's not from the use of a medical device. It's, for example, from slipping on a wet floor in the office or breathing air that is not very clean, and so on. Risk perception and tolerance varies from person to person. Do you agree with that? I think you would. If you think about your family or friends, people whom you know, you will notice that there is a different degree of risk perception and tolerance among them. If you answered yes, you would not be wrong that risk perception and tolerance is different from people to people. In fact, there is this paragraph in ISO 14971 2012 version that says, it is well established that the perception of risk often differs from empirically determined risk estimates. So what does this mean? It means different people have different perceptions, and that what we do in our calculations to determine or estimate the risks may be very different than how people feel about it. Therefore, the perception of risk from a wide cross-section of stakeholders should be taken into account when deciding what risk is acceptable. So who are the stakeholders? Our stakeholders are our patients, nurses, patients' families, doctors, insurance companies, regulatory agencies, our own companies, many stakeholders. The standard continues to say, to meet the expectations of public opinion, it might be necessary to give additional weighting to some risks. So this means that for some cases, people have more fear of some things, and in that case, we have to do more to satisfy the stakeholders. It is interesting to note that the stock market works precisely because of this diversity of risk perception. Why would a speculator sell a stock in the same moment that another one buys it? Because one person sees the risk of losing money on that stock higher and sells, while another person sees the risk of losing money lower, so they buy. Take a look at this picture. This is a real picture taken before there was Photoshop. Do you think the person in the pink shirt has a different risk perception and tolerance than the people in the yellow clothing? Clearly, yes. This picture, by the way, was taken in the 1990s in New York State. When an accident happens, the public perception of risk goes to 100%, or at least jumps quite high. Do you remember the 2 crashes of the Boeing 737 MAX airplanes? Many people became afraid of flying on that airplane because they were certain if they got on that airplane, they would die. Another example right now is that we are living in the coronavirus times. We hear about deaths of people in the news all the time, but it seems distant. But if you happen to personally know somebody who died from it, your perception of risk would jump much higher. Let's talk about emergent system properties. Properties of a system as a whole depend on the system components and their relationships. Although each system component has properties, the system has properties that depend on the relationships among the parts. Emergent properties are a consequence of the relationship between system components. That is saying that knowing the properties of individual components of a system is not enough to know the properties of the whole system. System properties emerge only when the system is created. Here, they can only be assessed and measured once components have been integrated into the system. So what's saying is the properties of a system can only be assessed and measured once the components have been integrated into creating the system. Imagine if you picked 11 people whom you knew well individually to form a football team. They have never played with each other on a team before. Would you know how the team will perform beforehand? No. The team performance will only be known after the team is formed and plays together as a team. There are two types of emergent properties: functional emergent properties and non-functional emergent properties. The functional emergent properties appear when all the parts of a system work together to achieve some objective. If I gave you a box of bicycle parts, can you ride that? Clearly no, because until the parts are assembled together to create a bicycle, the function of transportation does not emerge. There are also non-functional properties that emerge when the system becomes a system. For example, reliability, maintainability, safety, and security. That is to say, you cannot say, for example, what is the safety or reliability of a system when they present to you only a collection of parts, because it's not a system. It doesn't do anything yet. System reliability depends on component reliability, but unexpected interactions can cause new types of failures and therefore affect the reliability of the system. Can we build a safe medical device? When I ask this question in my classes, majority of people answer yes. In fact, it may surprise you that the answer is no. Safe means risk-free. There is no risk-free medical device. However, we can make a medical device that is acceptably safe under certain constraints. Under constraints, for example, for an intended use, for an intended user, in an intended environment, and for a certain duration of time. And we can reduce the residual risks of a system under these constraints to an acceptable level and show that the benefits outweigh the risks. In that case, we can make a medical device that is acceptably safe. I want to show you this in a graphical way. Notice first, though, that risk and safety are opposing concepts. That is, as risk goes up, safety comes down. On this graph, on the vertical axis, I have safety from 0 to 100%. So 100% safe means a zero risk device. This graph presents the safety distribution over a span of some parameter. Let's consider this parameter temperature. LSL stands for lower spec limit and USL stands for upper spec limit. So this shows that the device is safest between its lower and upper spec limits, where we have designed the device to operate, and as the device gets too hot or too cold, its safety goes down. This red arrow here represents what we call residual risk. That is the distance from the safest that we can make a device to 100% safe. this distance is non-zero, and as engineers, design engineers, we aim to make this distance as small as possible. So we aim for 0. And this blue line here represents the acceptable risk or minimum amount of safety that's acceptable. So if you look at this diagram, you can see that this product is acceptably safe when it is operated between the lower spec limit and the upper spec limit. And as the device gets warmer, gradually safety comes down and it intersects the blue line, which means at this point it becomes not acceptably safe. Also, if it gets colder, at some point it becomes not acceptably safe. I want to give you a little context about ISO 14971. ISO 14971 is the central standard for safety risk management of medical devices. There are a number of other safety standards that are applicable to medical devices, and they make normative references to ISO 14971. Here I'll give you 5 examples. So first, the standard definition of the ISO 14971 is the application of risk management to medical devices. If your medical device has electrical properties and not implantable, then IEC 60601-1, which is a family of standards, reference ISO 14971. Almost every medical device has some interface with a human, so that it is subject to usability engineering, and therefore you would be subject to IEC 62366. If your medical device has software, then you would be subject to IEC 62304. If your medical device makes intimate contact with human tissue, then biocompatibility is a factor and you would be subject to ISO 10993-1. And if you do a clinical evaluation of your medical device, and if you do a clinical investigation of your medical device, you would be subject to ISO 14155. All of these standards make normative references to ISO 14971, and that means that they become one parcel. In other words, you cannot conform to ISO 14155 unless you also conform to ISO 14971. Let's talk about ISO 14971 and its expectations, what it takes to be conformant to ISO 14971. But before we do that, let me ask you a question. From what I've spoken so far, what is risk? Choose from the multiple answers that are presented to you. Okay, let's continue. The title of the standard ISO 14971 is Application of Risk Management to Medical Devices. Before ISO 14971, there was no standard for medical device risk management. It was originally developed in 1998 with participation of delegates from 112 countries. ISO Technical Committee 210 Working Group 4 was formed to produce ISO 14971. Simultaneously, IEC 60601-1 third edition was planning to include risk management in it. The two groups decided to create a joint working group, and it was called IEC SC 62A, Joint Working Group 1, to create ISO 14971. This means that ISO 14971 is simultaneously an ISO and an IEC standard. The first revision of ISO 14971 was released in year 2000. In year 2007, revision 2 was released, which removed and canceled revision 1. In 2012, the European community decided that the international standard, ISO 14971 2007 was not sufficiently aligned with the Medical Device Directive. So they added 3 annexes, ZA, ZB, and ZC, to it to create the conformity that they wanted. Later on in year 2019, December of 2019, revision 3 of ISO 14971 was released, and that is currently the state of the art, and it has removed the 2007 revision 2 of ISO 14971. There is a companion document called ISO TR 24971, which was first released in year 2013. This companion document is intended to help with the understanding and implementation of ISO 14971. It was re-released in year 2020 under revision 2, and it has grown quite a bit. There's a lot of information in this document. It is not normative, it's just help for people who want to conform to ISO 14971. ISO 14971 provides the medical device manufacturer with a framework to systematically manage the risks to people, property, and the environment associated with the use of a medical device. It doesn't tell you how to do risk management, but it explains the expectations for doing proper risk management. ISO 14971 expects a process for risk assessment, evaluation, control, and monitoring. The standard does not show you or tell you what is an acceptable risk level. It says that must be defined by the manufacturer. The standard recognizes that management has a great influence on the safety of medical devices, and therefore it bestows a lot of responsibilities on management. For example, that they should assign competent personnel for performing risk management and to define and document a policy for establishing risk acceptability criteria and to periodically review the suitability of the risk management process. In this slide, I am showing you figure 1 of ISO 14971. It shows the framework for risk management. As you can see, it has some major sections. The top section is risk analysis, and it stipulates certain activities, for example, identifying the intended use and reasonably foreseeable misuse, identifying the characteristics related to safety, identifying the hazards and hazardous situation, and estimating risks. This is the risk analysis section. Now, by the end of this section, we know what the estimated risks are, and then we can evaluate those risks. And then the next section is risk controls. Here is the area where we do things to reduce or control the level of risk. Some of the activities mentioned here are to do risk control option analysis, to implement the risk control measures, then evaluate the residual risks. These would be the individual risks. Do a benefit risk analysis, and check to see if there are any risks arising from the risk control measures. It is possible sometimes when we fix something, some kind of a risk, then we actually break something else or make something else worse. So we need to be cognizant of that. And then checked for completeness of risk control. And then we move to the evaluation of overall residual risk. A medical device presents a number of individual risks, but put together that becomes the overall risk of the medical device. It is what matters to patients, not individual risks, but the overall residual risks. So to arrive at this box here, we need to know what the overall residual risk of the medical device is, and then evaluate that. The next activity here is the risk management review, which has a number of activities. The output of this step is the risk management report. Once the device is approved and is released, then we go into production and post-production activities, which has a number of activities. Generally speaking, that's about information collection, about how the device is performing, reviewing that information and taking appropriate actions due to those information that we have collected. So risk analysis, that was the first activity that we need to do. We need to identify the intended use and reasonably foreseeable misuses. Reasonably foreseeable misuse is defined as use of a product or a system in a way that was not intended by the manufacturer, but which can result from readily predictable human behavior. That's the official definition of reasonably foreseeable misuse. The next thing that we need to do is to identify characteristics related to safety. Every medical device has some characteristics that would give rise to hazards. For example, an X-ray machine radiates X-rays. That's a characteristic of the device. And these X-rays could be harmful. An implantable device makes intimate contact with human tissue, and that could cause reactions or sensitivities. The next thing to do is identify all the hazards of the device and their corresponding hazardous situation. And here we estimate the risks for each of those hazards. If we do these 4 things, then we have a conforming risk analysis process. So let's talk about risk estimation. How do we estimate risks? This is also a figure from ISO 14971. And it says that there's a progression from the hazards through a sequence of events to a hazardous situation, and then from there to harms. It says that there are circumstances that could affect the severity of the harm that a person can receive. So circumstances regarding the transition from the hazard to hazardous situation, and also from transitioning from hazardous situation to harm. So on the left side of the figure, you see that it says the probability of a hazardous situation occurring is called P1. So this is the probability that we could arrive at the hazardous situation from a hazard. Then the next part of the figure, it says that P2 is the probability of a hazardous situation leading to harm. So when we are in a hazardous situation, we don't necessarily get harmed. There's a probability, and that's called P2. And then it says that if you multiply P1 by P2, that gives you the probability of occurrence of harm, or this is really what risk is. Simple as that. The probability of receiving harm in a hazardous situation. Before we continue with the webinar, let me ask you another question. From the material that I've presented to you, can you answer this question? Who determines the risk acceptability criteria? Choose from the multiple answers presented to you. Now we come to the next activity in the process, which is risk controls. The standard says do risk control option analysis. There are 3 options that we are given in the order of preference. First is to make your device inherently safe by design or manufacture. So this means your device is just safe by itself. There is nothing the user needs to know or do. It's just safe by itself. And you can achieve this either in your design or in the manufacturing process. If you're unable to do that, the next best thing is to put protective measures in the medical device itself or in the manufacturing process to prevent hazards from causing harm. And if that's not possible either, then the next best thing that you can do is to provide information for safety and, where appropriate, training, so people know how to use your device and be safe with it. So now that we have found some things to do to reduce risk, we implement those risk controls. But just implementing risk control doesn't mean for sure that risk is controlled and reduced. So now we have to verify those risk controls. And there are two steps in that. One is to verify that we actually did implement the risk control, and the other one is to verify that it's effective. In other words, is the risk control really reducing risk? Do we have any evidence to support that claim? That's what this means. Now we need to look at risks arising from risk control measures. We need to check to see, did our risk control that we implemented cause additional risks, new ones, or exacerbating some of the existing risks? In that case, we need to evaluate and see if we can control those risks, or decide whether the risk control that we did is actually worth it. Maybe it's making things worse. Next, we need to check for completeness of risk controls. And this means we need to ensure that all the risks that have been identified have been controlled. Nothing fell through the cracks. And we need to do residual risk evaluation. At this point, we have individual risks identified and estimated, so we need to evaluate those, but we also have to do an overall residual risk evaluation. After risk controls are done, the risk that remains is called residual risk. There are individual residual risks. These are for each hazard and hazardous situation, and collectively they create an overall residual risk for the whole device. The standard requires the evaluation of the individual residual risks and the overall residual risk. To do risk evaluation, we need to have risk acceptance criteria. So we evaluate the risks by comparing our estimated risks against the risk acceptance criteria. The risk acceptance criteria must be documented in our risk management plan. So we have done this already, but at this point, we can find it in the risk management plan. Sometimes we can find harmonized or national standards that address some of our hazards. That's a fortunate thing. We can use conformity to those standards as risk acceptance criteria. But many times there aren't any standards related to a hazard that we are trying to control. In that case, we compare our residual risk to the residual risks of the state of the art. The state of the art is really the best practice out there, given the experience, knowledge of science, technology, and practices in the clinical settings. That becomes our benchmark. We strive to have our risks to be less than or equal to the state of the art. We also need to address the stakeholder concerns. For example, the advisory boards, focus groups, patient associations, anywhere where we can identify specific patient stakeholder concerns. We need to include that in our risk evaluation. Now we come to benefit risk analysis. This is another activity that's required by ISO 14971. We can only consider benefits that are supported by valid scientific evidence, such as clinical studies. Clearly, we can't just make up benefits and say that our device delivers those benefits which are unsupported. Factors to consider when we do benefit risk assessment are magnitude of the benefits, that is, how much is the magnitude? Is this providing a significant benefit to the patients or just a little bit? The likelihood of receiving the benefit. As we know, not everybody receives the benefit from medical device. Some people receive it, some people get a lot of benefit, some people get maybe little benefit. So the question is, what is the likelihood of receiving the benefit? Next is the duration of the benefit. Is this device providing a benefit to the patient for a short amount of time, for a long amount of time, maybe for the whole lifetime? And the next factor to consider is the comparable therapies. Are there competing devices that provide equal or better therapies, values to the patient? Could there be an alternative therapy such as pharmaceutical therapy, or even things such as diet or exercise, they have to be considered when we are doing our benefit risk analysis. We compare the overall benefits of the device against the overall risks of the device. The aim is to demonstrate that the benefits of the device overall outweigh its risks. Often, this is based on expert opinion from an advisory panel. Now we come to the risk management review. We need to review our risk management activities to ensure that we performed our risk management properly according to our risk management plan. Also to show that the overall residual risk is acceptable, and show that appropriate methods are in place to obtain relevant production and post-production information. The main output of risk management review is the risk management report. The risk management report is an executive summary of all your work and is intended to persuade a regulatory agency that your product is worthy of being approved, that the device is acceptably safe, and its benefits outweigh its risks. Your risk management report needs to be clear and understandable. Take special care to write your risk management report well. You don't want your reviewer, your regulatory reviewer, to be confused, frustrated, and not really understand what did you do and did you meet these 3 expectations here. Remember, you are trying to convince a reviewer to approve your medical device. So write your risk management report in a way that is convincing. Let me talk about the old way of thinking about doing risk management. The old way was to think that we have a product development process. We go through the process, and at the end of it, and when the product is finished, then we find somebody to do a risk management retrospectively and write a report and then call it done. Not only is this unacceptable by regulatory agencies, it's also not a good way to do business. Let me show you a way to get real value for your medical device risk management. In this slide, I have represented a middle band here that represents a typical product development process. We have a concept phase, then we go from there to system requirements and architecture, then from there we go to design and development, and the verification phase, then validation and transfer to manufacturing, then production ramp up, and then maintenance. Maintenance means the duration of time where the product is in the field. This hopefully is a very long time. And then after some time, the company decides to obsolete the device and remove it from the market. This is the birth to death of a medical device. The black triangles here show the product development activities. So it talks about concept start, concept release here, project commencement. And at this point, it means management has decided to commence building this product. So the design and development starts. This is usually a lengthy process here, anywhere 3-5 years maybe. And then these other activities. And over here, we also are doing post-market surveillance, collecting information about the product and continuously feeding it back into our risk management process. The blue triangles are the areas where risk management can add value. This is the pre-market risk management. And the green triangle are the post-market risk management activities. So let me show you how you can get value from your risk management process. In the beginning, at the concept release stage, we start risk management by creating our risk management file and writing our risk management plan. At this point, we don't have a design yet. We have just a concept. We have some system requirements and an architecture. Based on that, we can do a preliminary hazard analysis. We can, at this point, have enough knowledge to decide whether this is a good project to move forward with or not. Imagine if you did your preliminary hazard analysis based on the available concept knowledge and design. Not the design of the product, but the design of the concept. And you found that this product can never be made acceptably safe. There are just risks that are unmanageable. Wouldn't it be better to cancel the project there before commencing the project, instead of starting the project, spending some time and money, maybe some years, and then realizing at some point that that was a bad idea? So risk management can serve as an advisory to management to let them know whether this project will, at the end, be safe enough to be approved. And if the decision is yes, this analysis also gives you another side benefit, and that is it tells you where the safety critical aspects of the system are going to be. So they can advise, this risk management can advise product development by letting them know where to focus their resources, what areas of the design are the most critical, so that you can invest your time and energy on those areas more than the other areas which are of low or no risk. As the design starts, we have some early versions of the design. We can start doing DFMEA, Design Failure Modes and Effects Analysis, and that can provide some value to the company by providing inputs for design improvement. I have had many experiences where during the early design phase, by doing a DFMEA, we discovered weaknesses in the design and were able to correct the design early on before much had been done, and that was very efficient for everybody's time and money and resources. Then as the design progresses, a manufacturing process can start to be penciled in as maybe early versions, early drafts. We can start doing process FMEAs, even starting from those early drafts, and identify areas of criticality in the manufacturing process. So then again, we can design our manufacturing process so it focuses its resources in the right places. Use-misuse FMEA, that's UM-FMEA, is about failures of the user to use a product appropriately. What are the consequences of those? And we can feed that information back to usability engineering, who can then define things in the design that can help make the product more usable. And then there's just one more thing here, sample size selection. You probably have heard around the company a lot talking about risk-based decision making. We want to make decisions based on risks. One of those decisions is how many samples to test. As you may know, samples are sometimes expensive or even hard to get in the early phases of the product, because maybe we can only make few copies of the prototypes. And also, testing itself takes time and costs money. So doesn't it make sense to do a risk-based decision on how many samples you're going to test, so that you test more samples when you're testing some safety critical aspect of the system, and test fewer samples when you're testing a lower safety risk part of the design? So if you want to make risk-based decisions, where are you going to get risk? How do you know what the risk is? From risk management. So here's another place that risk management can add value by helping the company focus their resources in the right places. Then, of course, we need to have a risk management report, and this is necessary to get approval. So that's an output. We always have to have this one. And then as the product goes into the field, hopefully for a long time, knowledge is continuously gathered by post-market surveillance. We are learning about how the product is doing, where the areas of weakness are. Have there been any new hazards or harms that maybe we missed in our pre-market risk management? Because pre-market risk management is a predictive engineering activity. Well, predictions are not usually perfect. Sometimes we may miss something, or we may underestimate a risk. So we learn that by post-market surveillance. And that information is fed back to design and manufacturing to improve the design. And these blue things, these green triangles are just some elements of post-market risk management. For example, periodic safety update report or summary of safety and clinical performance. I won't go into that area in this webinar. And then there's the risk management review, which is a review of the risk management process for suitability. This is just part of your QMS. Management is required to periodically review the risk management process for suitability. It is much better to build safety into a system rather than adding it to a nearly completed design. If you ever have had the experience of finishing your risk management late in the game and identifying weaknesses in the safety of the system, you may have found out that it's either very difficult or nearly impossible to make changes to correct for those safety risks. It may mean to either abandon the project or starting from the earlier phases or redoing a lot of work which is incredibly expensive and not wise. Before we move into the Q&A section, let me ask you one last question. In your company, do you get real value from risk management towards your product development? Now we move to our Q&A, and if you have questions about this presentation or about safety risk management, you can reach out to me at my contact information below.